All right, so welcome everyone to our weekly Parsha class in which we dive into the orchard of Torah. We call it the orchard because orchard is the English translation of the word Pardes. Pardes, which is an orchard, and Pardes also is an acronym for four words: Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, the four different ways in which to appreciate Torah, the meaning, the simple meaning of Torah, the secrets of Torah, the hints in the Torah, and the way to derive Torah. And each verse has all four lenses that we can approach it from. Today is a special day. In addition to the Torah we're going to be studying today, today is a special day because today is Rosh Chodesh. Today and tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, the beginning of the month of Tammuz. But let's jump into the text today and talk about the Torah portion, which includes one of the more bizarre stories in the Torah, a very profoundly important story with life lessons that we are meant to hold on to. The story of Korach. So the Torah portion, as you should see it in front of you, begins chapter 16, verse number 1. Now let's start by doing some of the basics and then reviewing, we won't go through all of the Rashi, which is in the colored text, but some of it. And then we'll see if we can get to some of the more mystical elements that exist in the Parsha as well. All right, says the pasuk, Vayikach Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kahas ben Levi. Korach, the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kahas, the son of Levi. V'Dasan ve'Aviram, and Dasan and Aviram b'nei Eliab, the children of Eliab. Ve'on ben Peles, as long with On ben Peles, b'nei Reuven, the descendants of Reuven. I don't know if I've ever done it this way before, but let me pose it a simple question. Reading this verse and looking at it maybe a second time, do any questions come to mind? And the truth is, the questions which would come to mind would probably be by reading the Hebrew text, because the English text is not a direct, perfect translation. The English text kind of smooths out the problems that exist within the Hebrew text. But reading the Hebrew text, does anyone see, and do any questions come to mind with text number 1? No pressure. Yes, I'd love to hear it.
So I don't really, not very great with my Hebrew grammar, but it seems like there's a lack of verbs. Like it's just like listing names. I think the only verb is vayikach.
Vayikach.
I'm saying it right. Vayikach. Yeah.
Now, to be fair, it's a good point. To be fair, though, verse number 2 is then describing what happened. And they confronted Moses together with 250 men from the people of Israel.
That's true.
So let me share two questions. One is precisely the word which you described. The one word is vayikach. Almost all the commentaries ask the same question, which is, vayikach means and he took. But it does not describe what Korach took. All it says is vayikach Korach, which again, that's why the English doesn't really translate this. But over here it just says took. Assuming, see the words in the brackets here are what are commentary. They're not the translation of the words. So if you remove those words, all it says is Korach, son of Yitzhar, son of Kahat, son of Levi, took, along with Dasan and Aviram, the sons of Eliab, and On Peles, descendants of Reuven. The word took makes no sense. Vayikach. So in English, it's 10 words in. In Hebrew, it's the first word. Vayikach. Korach took. What did he take? The wording over here should be, and Korach, and Dasan, and Aviram, and On ben Peles gathered, and then they approached Moshe. So the question which all of the commentaries talk about is the word vayikach. What is the significance? What is not what the significance? What does it mean? What exactly did Korach take? That's question number one. Question number two is, why does it list Korach's lineage going back 3 generations? Korach, son of Yitzhar, son of Kahas, son of Levi. And then, so why is it necessary to tell us who his grandfather and great-grandfather was? And if it's necessary to go back 3 generations, why not go back 4 generations? Why not Korach, son of Yitzhar, son of Kas, son of Levi, son of Jacob? Or go further to Yitzchak. It's unusual for the Torah to introduce someone by listing 3 generations. I mean, we very commonly, most commonly, what's listed is 1 generation. So-and-so, like last week, we spoke about the spies. Just a second, I'm going to close the window. Last week, we spoke about the spies. And each spy was introduced with his name and his father's name, which is commonly the case. When people are chosen, they mention them in the father's name. Here it mentions not just his father, Yitzhar, but also his grandfather, Kahas, and also his great-grandfather, Levi. And then it stops there. Okay, those are 2 basic questions. And let's now go a little bit further. What happens? Let's go to verse number 2. Vayakumu lifnei Moshe, and they gathered in front of Moshe. Va'anoshim ibnei Yisrael chamishim u'masayim. And there were 250 people alongside them. Nisiei Ada, chieftains of the congregation. Kriyei Moed, members of the assembly. Anshe Shem, men of great repute. Men who had great reputations. These are leaders. Korach, along with 250 leaders among the Jewish people, gather in front of Moshe. Vayikohalu, and they gather in front of Moshe, al Moshe ve'al Aaron, Moshe and Aaron, vayomer alehem, and they said to them, Rav lachem, you take too much upon yourselves. He called ha'eda kulon kadosh. The entire assembly is holy, uvetocham Hashem, and among them is God. Umadua tisnasu al kahal Hashem. And why do you lift yourselves up on the community of God? Okay, so this is the essential. First 3 verses tell us that a group of people basically gathered and told Moshe, you are keeping all the leadership positions to yourself. You're selfish. We're all equally holy. We all stood at Sinai, and therefore, why should you have this leadership role above us? Fine. And then the Torah portion goes on to spell out the story. The confrontation continued. And then miraculously, as the Torah spells out in detail, there was this face-off in which the Korach and his followers were swallowed up by the earth. But let's talk about these few verses. And let's focus on this word vayikach, and Korach took. What exactly did Korach take? So let's go to Rashi. First is Rashi, vayikach Korach. Rashi says, lokach es atzmo. He took himself to one side. Lihios nechlak mitocha eda leorer ala kuhuna. He took himself to a side and disassociated himself with the congregation to contest the appointment of Aaron to the kahuna. That's what it means. He separated himself. Okay, this is what it means, that he took himself. In other words, he took himself and separated himself from the community. The next Rashi, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the next Rashi, let's go to Ben Yitzhar, the son of Yitzhar, the son of Kahas, the son of Levi. Says Rashi, Velo hizkir as Ben Yaakov. The verse does not mention that he was a descendant of Jacob. It just says the son of Yitzhar, his father, Kahas, his grandfather, Levi, his great-grandfather. But it stops at Yaakov. Why does it stop at Jacob? So Rashi tells us, because Jacob prayed that his name should not be associated with this event. Jacob prayed not to be mentioned in connection with their quarrel. As it is stated in the book of Bereshit, at the end of Jacob's life, when he's blessing his sons, and he confronts Shimon and Levi, and his words over there seem to be rather harsh. One of the things he says is "B'kahalam al techad kavodi," which translates, "My honor shall not join their assembly." Somehow he's asking God, I don't want my name to be associated with the assembly of Shimon and Levi. And so here you see that Yaakov was saying, I don't want to be associated with this conflict that their descendant, which is Korach, is going to bring up. Now, the next Rashi is very long, and it's a fascinating Rashi about Dasan and Aviram. And when you have your own time, I encourage you to read it because it describes the argument that they approached Moshe with. What exactly their logic was, and they used a rather ingenious approach to open up the conflict with Moshe. But I'm going to leave that aside because that would take up the entire whatever time we have left, and then some. So this is the Rashi's interpretation of them gathering in front of Moshe. But let's discuss this from a little bit of a deeper perspective. Let's look into the Zohar. The Zohar is the mystical component of the Torah, and the Zohar focuses on the words Vayikach, which we said earlier, because Vayikach doesn't seem to make any sense. And the Zohar says some very powerful words that are worth listening to and learning and repeating. Vayikach Korach took. What did he take? Which is what all the commentaries ask. Mahu Vayikach, what is it that Korach took? Says the Zohar, Natal Eitza Ra'al Lenafsho. He took a bad bit of advice for himself. He took a bad piece of advice and ran with it. Now, who is it that gave Korach his advice? Torah doesn't tell us. The Medrash tells us. And that is that the person who gave Korach bad advice was his wife. It was his wife who saw him one day and said to him, Korach, you could be so much more powerful and more famous than you are, and you're letting Moshe, our cousin, get away with all of the glory. And she instigated him and she pushed him. She says, go confront him. Go gather people, start a rebellion, you'll be successful. There are plenty of other people out here who feel like I do, that Moshe is taking the glory for himself. And she says, you need to stand up for yourself. You need to stand up for your honor. And Korach took that advice. Korach, that's what it means, he took. He accepted that advice, as terrible as it was, and he ran with it. You see the influence of one's wife, that it was his wife who led him on this path. But the Zohar continues. The Zohar continues. Natal Eitzaral Lenafsho. He took bad advice for himself. Says the Zohar. Kol harodef achar davar she'eno shelo. Remember these words. Anyone who runs after something which is not theirs. And what we mean by that is something which is inherently not supposed to be mine. When you run after something that is not yours, firstly, hu boreach mimenu, that which you are pursuing runs away from you. V'lo od, and furthermore, ela af ma sheyesh bo oved mimenu. Even that which you already have, you lose. When a person runs after that which they shouldn't have, whether it's a form of jealousy, pursuit of honor, jealousy of someone else, and you run after that which you don't have and you don't need to have, then not only won't you get that, you will lose that which you already have. Korach, says the Zohar, Radaf achar davar she'eno shelo. He ran after something that was not meant for him. The eshelo ibad. He lost that which was his. Korach nichnas l'machlokas. At the core of this week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion, some Torah portions share numerous ideas or perhaps nuanced ideas. The message of this week's Torah portion is as clear and as simple as can be. Probably as simple and as clear as if not more so than any other message of the Torah. And this week's Torah portion teaches us of the dangers of someone who holds on to a machlokes, to a dispute. Someone who holds on to a dispute, the dangers associated with holding on to division and a dispute. That is the essence of this week's Torah portion. That's why it spends a whole section of Torah talking about it, to remind us of the terrible consequences of machlokes, of holding on to dispute. According to some, it's not, there is a verse in the Torah report, later in this Torah report. Let me see if I can find it. All right, so it says it elsewhere. I don't know exactly where, but it says one should not be like Korach and his followers. So there are some who actually consider that to be one of the 613 commandments of Torah. That one of the 365 prohibitions of Torah is one who sustains a machlokes, one who sustains a disagreement. Machlokes is not, the word disagreement is a little bit light. Disagreement could be on a topic, on a Torah topic, and that's fine. There's many areas in Judaism where there's disagreeing opinions, and one holds one side, one's the other. But the idea of holding on to a dispute is something which some would say is actual one of the prohibitions of Torah. One of the 600 violations of 613 mitzvahs of Torah is the prohibition against holding on to a dispute. But going back to the Zohar, Zohar says, what is so terrible about machlokes, about dispute? He says, machlokes, when there's a dispute, when there's a rift here on earth, it causes there to be a rift in the upper realms as well. And the entire world suffers from the rifts and the disputes that exist between people. Machlokes is the opposite of shalom. The opposite of peace is machlokes. And one who says, I'm just reading from the Zohar, Mishecholek al hashalom, someone who goes against the concept of peace, someone who goes against peace, Cholek al Shema HaKadosh, is literally going against God. God and peace are synonymous. Now, there's always going to be issues which drive us apart. There's always, because we see things differently, we view things differently. But a person has to be in a constant state of pursuing peace. Even in areas of disagreement or conflict, in my mind, I should be asking myself, how could I resolve this? How could I bring peace? God, the Torah, everyone understands that life is not going to be monolithic. We're not going to all have the same approach to every topic. But when there's disagreement, firstly, there's a healthy way of disagreement, a way which there can be peaceful disagreement. And then when there is an unpeaceful disagreement, in my mind, I should always be challenging myself, how can I make peace of this situation? How can I bring peace to this situation? Boyu re'eh, says the Zohar, come and see. Ein ha'olam miskayim ela l'shalom. The world cannot survive unless there is peace. When God created the world, the world was unable to endure. The world in its earliest stages of existence could not endure, could not exist, until God brought peace to the world. Umahu, when did God bring peace to the world? Shabbos. Shabbos is the peace to the world. Shehi shlom ha'alyonim v'tachtonim. Shabbos brings peace to the upper realms and the lower realms. Only when Shabbos, the seventh day, was given to the world, which is a day of peace, that brought stability and continuity and endurance to the world. Therefore, one who battles peace, one who brings the opposite to the world, one who adds an element of division to the world, the world cannot tolerate that and is lost from the world. So the
I have a
Zohar,
question.
yeah, go ahead.
So by the time Shabbos came in the first week of creation, Adam and Chava had already sinned.
Correct.
So what like is it taking into account that sin as well? Like was the sin part of bringing the peace?
These words of the Zohar seem to indicate that even it's almost like that's a separate narrative. The issue of Adam and Chava and their sin, on a very basic level, and what I'm about to say is perhaps not accurate on all levels. On a basic level, that influenced Adam and Chava. That their sin caused them to be removed from Gan Eden and be sent out of Gan Eden. But as far as the world was concerned, it's almost as if the Zohar is saying, regardless of whether Adam and Chava sin or don't sin, if not for Shabbos, the world cannot survive. And what is the beauty of Shabbos? When we think of Shabbos, what do we think of? We think of a day of rest. We think of a day of refraining from work. We often call it Shabbos Kodesh, Day of Holiness. It's all true. But according to the Zohar, the reason Shabbos saved the world was because Shabbos brought peace to the world. Shabbos brings inherent peace to the world, both the world as we know it, or we call it Olam HaTachtonim, the lower realm as we know it, but also Elyonim, also in the upper realms, or maybe it even brings peace between the upper and lower realms. So Shabbos is about bringing peace to the world. This gives us perhaps a deeper appreciation of when we wish one another Shabbat Shalom. And what's interesting is we don't say that about holidays. No, we don't wish each other Chag Shalom. We don't wish a peaceful holiday. We don't say Pesach Shalom or Sukkot Shalom. The only thing is Shabbos. The only thing that we typically greet one another with peace is Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. And that's because the Zohar really gives us a deeper appreciation of that. Is Shabbos inherently brought peace to the world, which, as the Zohar says, is what brings not just goodness to the world, allows the world to exist. So to think of the profound message the Zohar is saying is that machlokes, division between people, not disagreement. I think it's important to emphasize that. Disagreement is okay. Division between people is antithetical to the existence of the world. And maybe this is why it explains the unique nature of the story. If God wants to punish Korach, and obviously God did, so we have many examples of people being punished. And typically, even in this Bar Shalom, we have an example of a plague which wiped out people. The idea of the ground opening up is such a bizarre punishment. Why would that happen? That the ground would open up and swallow a group of people. It's an unusual, unnecessary form of punishment. And why would it happen that way? And one of the ideas explained is because the message God was saying is that the earth cannot tolerate this behavior. It's almost as if the earth is saying, I can't support you anymore. The very world itself says, I can't support people whose goal is to establish and to strengthen division between themselves and other people. And that's the depth of this idea. And as simple as it is, it's something which is worth reminding ourselves of, especially as we live in a time in which there is a whole lot of disagreement out there. There are issues which keep on coming up, and more issues which people see differently. And again, that in itself is not a problem. It's not a problem that a topic will come up and I'll have one view and you'll have a drastically different view. It's when we turn our disagreements into division, that's where we run into this problem, which the Zohar is speaking so strongly about, is that division is antithetical to the very existence of the world. Division is antithetical to the existence of God. God is shalom, and the world needs shalom. And one who is strengthening machlokes, one who is looking to strengthen division, such a person is acting against God and acting against the stability of the world. But let's conclude with something a little bit more positive. So the Torah mentions Korach as someone who strengthens division. Who would be an example of someone who did the opposite? Who is someone who, instead of strengthening division, did whatever they could to avoid division. So there's a beautiful Gemara on the very first verse of our Torah portion. Again, same verse right in front of us. Korach, son of Yitzhar, son of Kas, son of Levi, Das, son of Aviram. By the way, I know I never answered the question of why 3 generations, not 4. I'm not going to get to that. Next year, God willing, this week's Torah portion. So this is this gentleman at the end, a man named On Ben Peles. So here we have him as part of this terrible dispute. The problem is later in the Torah portion, when it talks about this grand face-off between Korach and his people and Moshe, On Ben Peles is not there. What happened? He's missing later in the Torah portion. It talks about the punishment. On Ben Peles vanishes. We don't come across his name after this first verse. So the Talmud tells us like this: On Ben Peles went along with Korach's disagreement. And then later that evening, he came home. Who does he meet at home? His wife. And his wife says, On, or maybe she said, On, sweetheart, what are you up to? And he said, well, I'm part of this exciting new revolution. I'm joining Korach's forces against Moshe. And she said, and I'm paraphrasing because there's no video footage of this conversation. I'm paraphrasing. She says, what are you doing? What is the point? And she says, you stand to gain nothing. You stand to gain nothing from this. She said, if Moshe is right, well, then you're going to be the student of Moshe. You're going to be his subservient to Moshe. And if Korach is right, you're going to be subservient to Korach. So what do you gain? You stand to benefit nothing. One thing, Korach, all right, Korach is aiming for leadership, but you're not going to be leader regardless. So why get involved in a machlokas? And it's unclear whether she convinced him or not, but then she took it a step further. It says she fed him wine, she gave him wine to drink and caused him to fall asleep into a deep slumber. And then she went out to the front of her tent and says she let her hair down, which was immodest to the standards of there. She let her hair down. And what she was trying to accomplish is that nobody would walk into the tent. Because if people would walk by the tent and see On's wife there in a state of somewhat immodesty, so everyone would stay away. And that's exactly what happened. On fell asleep. He fell into a drunken stupor. And the next morning, when it was the real face-off between Korach and Moshe, which, as we know, the consequences of, On was busy enjoying a hangover and sleeping, and nobody was able to get to him because his wife was sitting at the front of the tent, making sure nobody would go in. So here you have an example. It's not mentioned directly. Here you have an example in the same verse where we learn about Korach and the people who are machzike machlokas, who strengthen machlokas. We have the Talmud telling us that within that very story, you have someone who made sure to do whatever she could to dissipate dispute, or at the very least, to make sure that her and her family were not involved in the dispute of Korach and his followers. So in life, we have to ask ourselves, first and foremost, to avoid machlokas, to avoid division, do whatever we can to stay away from division. And secondly, in a situation in which we can actually be helpful in resolving machlokas. If I know of a dispute or that it takes place, division that takes place, and there's something I can do, maybe it's a long shot. Maybe my action, maybe it's more likely that my action or my conversation won't help. But if there's even a long shot that my efforts can help bring peace, then I'm not just helping out a couple of friends. I'm actually stabilizing the world. I'm bringing divinity in the world, because shalom, peace, is an essential part of the existence of our world and a reflection of God's reality in the world. All right, that will conclude this discussion. We'll pause.